Hello, fellow Rebel Capitals. Hope you're well. So, could the Treasury merge with the Federal Reserve? The answer is yes. And another answer is they don't have to in order to achieve the same objectives. So, if you haven't been following the news, here's what's happening, and here's what prompted this video. It just turns out that Scott Bessent is one of the leading candidates for the new Fed chair position. And I'm sure a lot of you are asking yourself, well, that's Scott Bessent. That name sounds familiar. Oh, that's right. He's the US Treasury Secretary right now. So, how does that work? And I looked this up, and the term for the US Treasury Secretary is whatever the president says it is. So could he hold two jobs at the same time? Maybe, but does it matter? I think that's the bigger question. So let's get into it. And at the end of this video, you'll see how this technically could completely change the monetary system as we know it. So we got the screen share going. Let's go right over to the news of the day from Bloomberg. And let's see, let's do a screen share. I don't know where Josh just went. Okay, there we go. I'm gonna have to do this myself. Josh is MIA. Swiping on Tinder again. Okay, here we go. So Bloomberg, Bessent emerging as a contender to succeed Fed's Powell. Growing chorus of advisors inside and outside the Trump administration are pushing another name to serve as the next Fed chair. And this comes up in May of 2026. So that's who they're interviewing for, or that's the position that's when I should say they're interviewing for the position, or they're doing the preliminary searches now for May 2026. That's the best way to say it. Small list of candidates under consideration has included Kevin Warsh, a former Fed official whom Trump interviewed. But the bottom line here, as you guys know, is Trump is only going to pick someone who's a yes man or just an extension of Trump. So, I mean, let's just assume for a moment that Bessent is the next Fed chair. What's the difference between Bessent and Donald Trump as far as the policy? The answer is zero. Trump might as well elect himself Fed chair, because if Bessent just does exactly whatever or exactly what Trump wants, which he's been proven to be a very loyal guy. And I think there's a lot of things that Bessent says where he's kind of biting his tongue, but he knows that he has to say it because he has to make Donald Trump look good. So he's proven that he is that loyal guy. He has proven that if push comes to shove, he's going to do whatever Donald Trump wants him to do. And so if I'm Trump, especially if I'm Trump, because he thinks he's king of the universe and he thinks he's decisions are always going to be the best for good or bad. I want a guy in there just like Bessent. So let's keep going here. Given the amount of trust and confidence, said another way, let me just give you a thought experiment. If Bessent was the Fed chair right now, do you think interest rates, the Fed funds rate, would be at 4.3? No chance. No chance. If Bessent was the Fed chair right now, if I had to make a guess, my best educated guess, I think interest rates would be closer to the ECB. And in fact, I'll bet that's, I think, exactly where they would be. Because in Trump's mind, like, that's his competitor. And the lower the interest rates, the better in his mind. And so if we're competing with the ECB, then, or if we're competing with the Bank of Japan, as far as their economy, then we have to have interest rates just as low. So the highest interest rates could be is whatever the highest is between the BOJ and, let's say, the ECB. So let me look that up really quick here before we move on. So ECB rates, almost positive they're 2%. ECB rates. 2.25. So in my view, if Scott Bessent were Treasury Secretary right now, that's exactly where interest rates would be. They'd be 2.25%, maybe lower, because again, in Trump's mind, the lower the better. So if it's lower than 2.25, then that would give us a competitive advantage for against the Eurozone economy. So given the amount of trust and confidence global financial community has in Scott Bessent, he's an obvious candidate. Okay, we know that. Bessent proved he could implement President Trump's agenda. This is according to Steve Bannon. So if he has implemented Trump's agenda with China or trade or whatever his position requires, why would he not implement Trump's agenda if he was the Fed chair? And to be clear, this isn't the biggest news of Scott Bessent potentially becoming the Fed chair. This is just kind of the basic stuff. In a moment, we're going to dive into the real details as to why this would be huge, and this could potentially completely change the monetary system as we know it. Here it talks about Trump pushing Powell to lower rates. Wouldn't have to do that with Bessent. Trump has said many times that Powell is making a mistake by not lowering rates. Economist and Trump ally Arthur Laffer said Bessent is wonderful, but he already has a job, and his specialty is not monetary policy. First of all, give me a break. Oh, that's hilarious. Just think what Jerome Powell has done. Do you think the 2-year Treasury could have done a better job? The answer is yes. So if we just had a third grader, if we had a trained monkey that was Fed chair, and you just told them, hey, do whatever the 2-year does, minus 50 basis points or whatever, we would have, I would argue, better monetary policy. So do we really need an expert? And by the way, what is an expert? You're telling me that the PhDs at the Fed, that Jerome Powell is an expert in monetary policy? Really? Is that why he was telling us that inflation was transitory? I mean, give me a break. Come on. That's just totally laughable. But I do agree that every Republican thinks he is quote unquote wonderful and you do a great job, and he already has a job. Well, so what? Why can't he have 2 jobs? And if you're Trump, just fire him from the Treasury and hire him as the Fed, because you can always hire a yes man or another yes man for the Treasury position, because that's kind of part of the government. But the Fed is supposedly independent. So if you wanted the Fed not to be independent, well, what you need is a real loyal guy like Bessent at the Fed. So he's far more valuable to Donald Trump at the Fed than he is the Treasury, is my point. So now let's go over the mechanics here, the plumbing, because this is where it gets really interesting and quite frankly scary. So the first thing I want to point out to you guys is the Federal Reserve is currently insolvent. So I say that, and a lot of people are like, "Oh, George, you're just fear mongering. Blah, blah, blah. That's just clickbait." No, it's not. No, it's not. The Federal Reserve is absolutely, unequivocally insolvent right now. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So let's go over, and a lot of times what's great about AI is it does explain things in simple terms if you ask it to. So let's go over to our friend Mr. AI, and he can tell us what's going on with the Fed's balance sheet. So they have something called a deferred asset. Now, I've done several whiteboard videos on this topic and that have included this topic. And what a deferred asset is it's something that goes on the liability side of the Fed's balance sheet that reduces their current liabilities. So let's just assume for a moment they've got $100 in liabilities. Okay. Well, if they need to, but let's just assume they have $90 in assets. Well, you would say they're bust. They're bankrupt. They're tits up. They're done. Not really. Because what they have is this neat little financial accounting gimmick that is called a deferred asset. So what they do is they go ahead and say, well, we've got $10 of deferred assets. So that goes on the liability side of their balance sheet and reduces the liabilities from 100 down to 90. Now, all of a sudden, they're not insolvent. Now, all of a sudden, they have the exact same amount of assets as they do liabilities. Magic. So you say, what is this asset? Wow, how can I get one of these things? And isn't it weird? You've got an asset that's simultaneously a liability. Wow. Wonder how that works. Oh, basically what it is. Well, let's go to Mr. GPT. He'll tell us. What is a deferred asset? A deferred asset is a cumulative amount of future earnings. Wow, that's cool. Future earnings the Fed must retain to offset past losses. So basically what they're doing is they're saying, oh, no. We don't have negative equity. Are you crazy? Well, sure, our liabilities exceed our assets, but you're not factoring in the future profits that we're going to make. So when you include the future profits we're going to make, well, that reduces our liabilities to whatever we want. And then we go from insolvent to woohoo, now we're solvent again. Obviously this is just a insane accounting gimmick, but they get away with it and no one calls them out on it. Have you ever heard the mainstream media talk about this? Ever? Answer is no. But yet they've been totally insolvent since around 2022. So how do they go from being solvent to insolvent? Well, it's quite simple. When you're making 2% on the asset side of your balance sheet and you're paying 5% on the liability side, that dog don't hunt. And at a certain point in time, your equity is going to go beep and shrink to nothing. And then all of a sudden, you're upside down. Unless you have the magic of a deferred asset. Let's walk through it here. Normally, the Fed earns more interest than they pay, mostly on treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. When this flips, like during high interest rate environments, it begins operating at a loss. So again, all you guys know, the Fed pays banks for their bank reserves. That's what the Fed funds rate is now, right? Interest on reserves. Where do they get the money for this? And sure, they just create it out of thin air, but they're creating more liabilities. So usually what would happen is they're receiving payments from the treasuries, let's just say 2%. And they're paying 1%. Well, that works. But again, when they're receiving 2% and they jack up Fed funds, in other words, interest on reserves, to 5%, they have an operating loss. It's right here in ChatGPT. Instead of showing a negative liability, negative capital, in other words, instead of just admitting you're bankrupt, this stops remitting profits to the U.S. Treasury. Sure does, because normally what happens is if they have anything excess, if they have anything left over, so let's just assume for a moment they're receiving 2% on the treasuries they own, and or I think even the mortgage-backed securities. I think it's all the interest payments that they receive. And let's just assume they're paying 0% on the liability side of the balance sheet. Then that 2% that they're receiving goes right back to the treasury and offsets the deficit. Right? Technically, that's how it's supposed to work. Now, before we move forward, I want you to ponder something. as we go through the rest of this video. And remember, what is Scott Bessent's number one priority? What's his battle cry that he's always talking about? We got to reduce the debt. We got to reduce the debt. We got to reduce the debt. Right now, we're on a unsustainable path with the deficits and the debt. We've got to reduce the debt. Well, and he always said, well, right now, the interest payments over $1 trillion. Our interest payments alone are higher than our defense budget. I mean, you've heard this narrative over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And it's not just from Bessent, and it's not just from Republicans. It's from Democrats. It's from everyone in between. Right? So think about this. If you are worried about the interest payments on your debt, wouldn't you want an entity to own all your debt that would give you those interest payments right back? So think about it. Let's assume for a moment you have a credit card and you have a $10,000 balance. And what happens is when you make an interest payment, the bank immediately gives it back to you. Okay. So let's assume that your interest payments go from 5% to 10%. Do you care? No. Because if you're paying more, then the bank is just giving you back more. Because the bank is going to give you back whatever you pay. So who cares what interest rates are doing? Who cares what the interest on the debt is? Doesn't matter, does it? Are you starting to put the pieces of the puzzle together? If you can merge the Fed and the Treasury, you completely eliminate your debt problem. Now, I'm not someone that thinks the debt is a problem because interest rates are going to go up or the long end of the curve is going to skyrocket, or, I always say the debt in and of itself really isn't a problem. The government spending is the problem, because that's what distorts the economy and creates a lower standard of living, makes the economy far less efficient, misallocates resources, creates malinvestment. But the typical narrative you hear where the debt's a problem implies that it is a problem because there's going to be all this supply, no demand, and interest rates are going to blow out along the curve. So I'm not in that boat, but that's a topic for a separate video. The bottom line is the Republicans, the Bessent himself has been pounding the table on how this is a problem, how it is a problem. At a certain point, we're just going to issue too much debt and there's going to be no buyers. And then our interest rates are going to skyrocket. That's when he says that the debt is unsustainable. This is what he's talking about, right? But what are a couple components that go into the debt being more sustainable in Scott Bessent's worldview? Well, that would be if we get the debt to GDP down. Okay, well, let's think about that here. Right now, in fact, let's do this. How many? So what I'm doing here, I'm typing in the treasuries the Fed has. So the Fed has 4.2 trillion in treasuries. Okay, great. So we know, and this will be a fun kind of experiment here, guys. We'll just go through it in real time. So now let's go over to the debt to GDP. That should be super easy. 123%. Okay, so this is 123, and that's at 30, call it 36 trillion. So 36 trillion. Let me see if I can work some real quick math here. 36 trillion. So what we're going to do, 36 is we're going to, what do we do? I'm going to say that's 130 times. There we go. It's about 30. It's about 30. So the Fed owns 4.2, right? So if you were to merge the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, now all of a sudden, those liabilities, those Treasury liabilities, and the assets offset one another. So you really don't have the liabilities anymore. In other words, you don't have the debt because you own your own debt. So this would immediately drop the debt to GDP down to 100%. It would cut it by 23% just instantly. And then, you could just click a button and boom, you delete it. So that debt no longer exists. It would be just like you owing yourself money. So what makes this even more interesting is not only does it lower the debt to GDP, but it also would dramatically reduce the debt payments, or excuse me, the interest payments that were going to the Fed. Now you say, George, wait a minute. If it's going to the Fed, they're getting it right back. Correct. Usually they are, but right now they're not. Why? Because of the deferred asset. The deferred asset. So what this deferred asset is, just as a reminder here, is it's on the liability side, it's future revenues, but the future revenues coming from the Treasury. You see? So right now there's no reimbursement of anything going back to the Treasury until the Fed starts recuperating those costs or starts recuperating the revenue, starts recuperating the profit. And the only way that it can recuperate that is if it keeps the interest payments coming in from the Treasury, which does what? Increases the amount of interest payments coming from the Treasury, regardless on net, regardless of what's happening with interest rates themselves. You see? Now, for those of you who really have your thinking cap on here, you could be saying to yourself, okay, George, but they're just replacing one liability with another. Because if you're reducing, let's say, the liabilities of the Treasury by 4.2 trillion, which brings us down to call it 100% debt to GDP, well, what you're doing is you're adding on the Fed's liabilities. And the Fed's liabilities are bank reserves. Correct. But let's think that one through. Because a Treasury liability is way different than a bank reserve liability. Because what is a bank reserve at the end of the day? It's an electronic dollar. It's an electronic dollar issued, or more so, it's an electronic Federal Reserve note. That's a better way to say it. It's an electronic Federal Reserve note. Well, a Federal Reserve note is an IOU, technically, isn't it? But what does it owe you? It owes you gold. Not anymore. Not anymore. So since 1971, it's basically an IOU nothing. But what's interesting is it's still, or now, final settlement. So this IOU has gone from owing you something, gold, which would be final settlement, to the IOU itself being final settlement. You see? Now, is a Treasury final settlement? No. Now, it can be in the banking system, but we're going to shelf that topic for a moment just to kind of stay on track. But technically, is a Treasury final settlement? No. It's IOU dollars. So in the future, I'm going to have to get these dollars from somewhere to pay you. But a bank reserve is final settlement. I don't owe you anything. Not anymore. You already have what I owe you, or you already have the liability. You already have final settlement. That is the dollar bank reserve. It's basically the electronic Federal Reserve note. That's final payment, where Treasury is not. See? So if you're replacing the treasury liabilities with bank reserve liabilities, now all of a sudden that doesn't impact really what the treasury would have to do moving forward. It wouldn't impact the amount of treasuries they have to sell, the debt. It wouldn't impact the amount they have to tax. Now, if you're saying to yourself, George, well, that sounds a lot like MMT. Bingo. Correct. You are correct. So, what's the first step, if you will, to MMT? It's when you merge the Treasury and the Fed. That's what it's all about. So then all of a sudden, you can start making payments if you're the Treasury, and you don't have to issue debt. No debt. Why would you have to issue a Treasury? Why would you have to issue debt to make a payment? You wouldn't, because you just increase the bank reserve liabilities. You wouldn't increase the debt liabilities. Now, you may be saying to yourself, okay, George, this sounds too good to be true. Well, from a balance sheet standpoint, it's not too good to be true. It's actually quite easy. The release valve, of course, or the difference would be when the Treasury pays money, they have to take money in. So let's just exclude the Fed for a moment, right? So when they sell that Treasury or when they collect the tax, that is taking M2 out of the system if it's from a non-bank entity. And then when they spend the money back into the economy, it increases M2 by the amount that it subtracted M2 to begin with. So on net balance, there's no increase in the money supply. Now let's just exclude the banks for a moment because that makes it a little more confusing. But what would happen if the Fed Treasury or the Treasury Fed, whatever you want to call it, if they go ahead and they send out a UBI check? Easy. All they have to do is create the bank reserve, which is final settlement, final payment. So what would that do to the debt? Nothing. And what interest rate would you owe on it? Nothing. If you didn't want to pay any. Now you might want to pay interest on reserves or whatever it is, but fine, you can just create the reserves out of thin air. It doesn't even matter. It's not creating an additional liability on the taxpayer, let's say, or it's not creating a dangerous situation where we could run out of buyers for our treasuries and for our debt. There wouldn't be any debt, so we wouldn't have to worry about the buyers. Right now, would that increase the money supply in broad money, let's say, or M2? Yes, it would. Yes, it would. So then this takes us straight back to MMT. When looking at it through their eyes, the only constraint would be consumer price inflation. But it would completely eliminate this the big problem that everybody is talking about, from Bessent to Trump to Elon Musk to Paul Tudor Jones to Stan Druckenmiller. I'm sure Krugman has been talking about it. It instantly brings the debt to GDP that the taxpayer would be liable for, or the bond market would be liable for, down to 100%. And then, from there, you don't even, you could just keep it going down to 80, to 70, to 60, whatever you want. It would just be like a thermostat. You could just dial it in, right? And the only reason to really issue the treasuries would just be for collateral for the monetary system. Now, is Scott Bessent that sophisticated to where he's thought that through? I doubt it. Actually, I take that back. Before taking on the job as Treasury Secretary, I don't think he had that level of sophistication. Afterwards, I think he does, because I'm guessing when Yellen was kind of walking out the door and he was walking in, she said, hey, I got to show you why you should be issuing T-bills at the front end of the curve and a lot less debt at the long end of the curve. Because remember, Bessent was a big critic of that. he was very critical of Janet Yellen for issuing more at the front end than the long end, because I think he was saying, she should have taken advantage of lower interest rates, to reduce the debt burden. And then when he gets into office, he does the exact same thing. Why? Because he got the message that, oh, wait a minute, we can't take that collateral out of the system or you're going to implode the global monetary system. So now that we kind of understand the mechanics. I know this might be a little hard to follow, so I think I'll probably do the whiteboard this week on this topic so you guys can get a better visual. And when you get the visual on the whiteboard and how kind of everything works, I think it'll make a lot of sense to you. But now let's step back for a moment and say, okay, well, do we really need to merge these balance sheets at the end of the day? Do we really need to merge the Fed's balance sheet with the Treasury's balance sheet in order to achieve this same outcome? That right now, according to the this narrative that we got to reduce the debt, it's unsustainable. In order to achieve that outcome, the answer is no. You actually wouldn't have to merge the balance sheets. The only thing that you would need is the same guy. That's it. Or said another way, the only thing you would need is the exact same policy. You would just need the Fed to have the exact same policy or mandate, if you will, as the Treasury. That's it. And all of a sudden, you completely change the monetary system. You eliminate the government's need to even take on debt. Why would you do that? Why would you make an interest payment? Why would you issue a Treasury? And that is one thing that the MMTers get spot on. Spot on. Now, I'm not saying that I would not argue for that. That's a whole different topic, right? That's not that's accurately describing the mechanics, but that is not a prescription coming from George Gammon. That is not the solution. That would create a lot more problems. Obviously, this would create massive problems in the long run. But I think this could potentially be the start. That's why on Twitter I said we're flirting. When we're talking about Bessent now being the Federal Reserve Chair, even if he's no longer the Treasury Secretary, what we're doing is we're basically talking about either merging balance sheets to where he is both, or we're talking about the Fed having the exact same policy as the Treasury, which effectively would be merging the two balance sheets. And I think that the steps started, or the progression has been initiated today by taking Scott Bessent's name and throwing it into the hat for the next Fed chair. All right, guys, what do you do about this? Well, first and foremost, I can't give you an investment advice, but what I do is I always own gold. That's kind of the pillar of my portfolio, regardless of it being more conservative or more aggressive. I have two types of portfolios, and Royal Capital's Pro as an example, but they always start with gold. So now what's very interesting, as you guys know, silver has been catching up, and so have the gold miners, which is usually what you see in these cycles. But I thought an interesting question that we brought up yesterday on a video was, if you believe in this, what I call the gold catch-up trade, so silver catching up to gold, or the miners catching up to the gold, the percentage increase in price, and then exceeding it, which is what you see. In fact, silver, we went over this, from 2008 to 2011, it was up 4x. 4x. And gold only doubled, right? So then the question becomes, if you believe in this gold catch-up trade, and if you like the charts, you see these breakouts, and you're like, okay, we're at the beginning stages of this. Do you buy silver or do you buy the gold miners? Especially if we see more and more uncertainty, which I can assure you we would see if we have the policies or the exact same dude running the Fed and the Treasury, basically merging the balance sheets. You're going to see a lot of uncertainty there for sure. And I think that really drives people to gold itself. But bottom line here is I'll be doing a webinar this Friday, a deep dive as to, when you typically see silver make the move, how much of a move does it make compared to the minors, the majors, and the juniors. And hopefully I'll get some insights from my good buddy Chris McIntosh as to how he kind of sizes up the balance sheets with these juniors, because you can get huge upside, but you get even more upside if you buy the alpha instead of just buying the beta. And what I'm talking about is the GDXJ would be the beta. You're just taking a basket. But if you can pick the real winners within the GDXJ, again, just using that example, then you can get way more upside. So we're going to be going over that. I'm probably going to do a balance sheet analysis of the top 2 holdings of the GDXJ in this webinar. So this is one that you're not going to want to miss. Excuse me. So you can participate by going to georgegamma.com/pro, and you can just do the $1 trial of Rebel Capitalist Pro. See if you like it. You can participate in the webinar. And if you don't have time on Friday, you can see the rerun, or the archive of it will be in the Rebel Capitalist Pro forum right there on the homepage, and you can watch it at your leisure over the weekend. But this is going to be some intel that you definitely want if you're an investor that likes precious metals and is interested in buying silver or the gold miners right now, due to the fact that in these types of cycles, they tend to exceed the percentage price move in the in gold itself. All right, guys, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. As always, make sure you're standing up for freedom, liberty, free market capitalism, and we'll see you in the next video.